Second last session of the day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome along. So big, I don't even know where to look. Hey, watch that. Watch that. This is an interesting session. I like to start those off this way, just to set up and build the excitement for what's going on. This one is called Mastering Your Microsoft Azure Administrative Workstation. I assume that everybody in the room uses or knows of Microsoft Azure. You're at a Microsoft conference, Microsoft Azure, all about the cloud, that sort of stuff. So that's what we're talking about. The difference is this is all done completely from an infrastructure professional's perspective, a server hugger's perspective. So my background at Microsoft is I've been at Microsoft now for about 11 years, but I've been primarily working in my job in IT for the last 25. In some way, shape, or form, is the guy that literally sat down in front of the computer to jiggle the cable to get the printer to work ages ago. Progressed through a variety of different types of roles: help desk, LAN admin, sysadmin, network admin, wide area network guy, enterprise consultant, trainer, facilitator, all sort of stuff, to the point where I joined Microsoft. So I've kind of done a full gamut of different types of things. It's always been in the perspective of enterprise-sized or enterprise organizations, government organizations, working with data centers and infrastructure. And then about 2 years ago, while I was at Microsoft, my boss basically came to me and said, hey, we need to have someone that can go and talk to these infrastructure folks, my brethren, about Azure from an infrastructure perspective. And I'm like, okay, it sounds like a fun challenge. And so I've had to transform myself to become more and more of a cloud-based infrastructure individual that does not have a coding background. I'm not a dev. I'm an IT pro guy. I know how to spell Git, but I always thought that Git was related to some kind of a slur that you would say about someone as opposed to a source repository. And so I'm going to be introducing you to a bunch of different stuff and things that I've kind of learned throughout the different years doing this to kind of show you how I've kind of built my infrastructure environment in such a way that I can go ahead and work and function in this new world. When things function, as I look at my demo machine, it's not happy to be able to do things. But before I get started even further, just very quickly, if you wanted to get a hold of me during or after the event, the easiest way to do that is to basically hit me up on the Twitters, @RicksterCDN. You can also email me. That is my direct email address, rclaus@microsoft.com. Likewise as well, I have a blog that I do a lot of posts on and also videos on with Channel 9 on regularitguy.com. I think I might stumble over to one of the venues this evening that's down in that direction, and so in which case, just look for the guy with the green hat. Unless someone steals it on me, I'm the one that wears it, so you can find me during conferences in that kind of fashion. This is kind of the state that we're in right now, where individuals working in infrastructure are being asked to work more and more inside of a cloud environment. And it's been going on now for the last couple of years where it just seems overwhelming with the references to cloud technologies, cloud stuff, the cloud operating system, where everything all fits inside of that kind of cloud world. But if you look past the hype of the name and look into the actual things that are part of a cloud type of environment, like the keynote from what you saw from Brad Anderson a couple of days ago, to some of the newer technologies that we have in Server 2016, on-premises technologies as well, cloud type stuff is definitely in there, but we tend to kind of suffer with a environment that we're kind of overwhelmed with it to the point where you don't want to hear it anymore. So I'm at that point. I've gone past that point now, and this is kind of where I'm at this stage in my career development. So cloud in all general terms comes down to a term that was created by a marketing engine that eventually came to fruition with actual tangible things that people can understand, see, feel, and touch, as opposed to simply being used as a word that describes them. And I thought I'd just kind of step back through a little bit of history to kind of look at all those different things that have come up over the last while to see how many people have kind of done some of these things. Mainframes and terminals, the original PC when it came out, having to support terminal emulation software for those mainframes that you might have been supporting in the past, working with client-server machines, fax cards, old-fashioned fax lines, SAN, storage environments, email systems. All these different things were all revolutionary changes that have happened over the last 20 or so years. And if you work in infrastructure for that long, I'm pretty sure you've either touched them, managed them, worked them, and hopefully mastered them, and are now moving on to the next greatest thing. Otherwise, you're in the wrong industry, because it changes all the time. You're playing catch-up. So cloud is simply one more of these other things that you have to learn to harness. And that's hopefully why you're here. That's why you're sitting in on the sessions that I'm delivering about Azure, that my colleague down the front row there is talking about Azure Site Recovery for disaster recovery capabilities, just came up a little while ago. Or my other colleague in the front row who talks about the on-premises technology, cloud-like technologies that are out there, but they're on-premises and where they are. And even the things that Brad Anderson talked about with the concept of an Azure stack, which is really very cool, with the ability to go through and to operate the same way on premises with your own infrastructure, your own hypervisor, your own fabric that you look after, but you're deploying things on top of it the same way you'd be deploying it inside of our environment, inside of the Azure cloud. So I did my best to kind of go back even further in time. For those of you that are even younger than 25, this is already ancient history, for other types of IT professionals that had kind of faced these kind of challenges before. And I found a picture of what I believe to be the actual first IT professionals working for a company way back when to 1914, actually probably even 1909 to be exact, where every single company was responsible for actually building their own infrastructure to run power to power their industry inside of their factories that they're working with. This is actually a power generation company that was inside of a particular village or town inside of central USA. And if you look very closely, you can see two IT professionals here. The first one is the IT manager because he's wearing the hat at the front. The second one is the sysadministrator at the back because he's at the back of the photo. But they had very specialized skills to be able to go off and maintain and keep this thing running, to keep the rest of industry working within that particular company that they were in. The same way that we're responsible for being able to do that with all the IT infrastructure on a regular basis. Now, these folks had tools that they had to use that were unique to their jobs, that evolved over time to the point where infrastructure was just more economical to go ahead and to procure that infrastructure services, in this case it was energy, from a centralized grid by a provider that would allow them to tap in and keep their industry running, that they weren't having to maintain and look after every single time. The folks that are in this picture hopefully reskilled themselves and found other things to do within that organization, or they moved on to a different company that still needed to have that same type of services. We're faced with the exact same thing right now as infrastructure professionals. So in this case, I'm basically asking you with this particular session is, we all have specialized set of tools, skills, and jobs that we have to perform, and we're simply now evolving them to be able to work inside this new world of doing work. What are your skills and what are you bringing to the table? The best part about the solutions that we create up in the Microsoft world is the fact that we allow you to bring your skills and capabilities and tool sets that you're familiar with and bring them with you up into the next ones. You're still going to be using PowerShell to manage your infrastructure if it's on premises. You can still use PowerShell if you're going to be managing your infrastructure inside of a cloud environment. And that cloud environment is a data center in West US, North America, or in Melbourne, Australia, or in England, I guess London, I don't even know where it's England. London, England, where we just announced one of our newest data centers is going to be taking place last week. It doesn't matter where you are. You establish your secure connections, you run the programs you need to be able to go off and to manage and manipulate and work with that infrastructure, and then you provide services to your end users. That's still the same. So I'm going to be sharing you some of those tools that are inside of your toolbox, they're inside of my toolbox, to be able to go off and work with them, to work with the Azure infrastructure. Now, I did a session, not last one, but the one before that, where I talked about the very introductory facets of Azure infrastructure and Azure IaaS as a service or infrastructure as a service, the concepts of the machines, how they work, how you can configure them, the basic building blocks. This session is, okay, you now understand that, here's the tools you use to manage them. I do a session tomorrow which goes to a very much deeper level of detail about how do you architect solutions to be able to use Azure in the most efficient way possible to get the best performance. Because ultimately, that's what it's all about. You providing a service to your customers, your internal users, your internal customers, so that they can go off and do their tasks that they do every single day, and you move on to the next project to be able to go off and to do things. The difference is you choose the tools that work best for you, that match your skill sets, to be able to manage that infrastructure wherever that infrastructure happens to be. So, with that being said, as my long introduction, Azure. The primary way that you're going to be going off and interfacing and working with Azure is, what do you think? What's the first way you're going to do this? Brand new to Azure. Anybody? Can't hear you. The portal, the web. Yes, you know what the web is. Fantastic. The portal is there. Now, here's your first caveat before we even go there. There are two portals that exist inside of Azure for us to be able to use it. A little bit of history about them is that we had what's currently what I call, of course I'm going to get the naming police get mad at me, the classic portal, or the old portal, as I like to say. That one there is available and ready for you to be able to use. Let me just pull that guy up before I switch him over, just so you can see it, because I'm pretty sure you have before. And I'll switch my computer over in one moment. Once I authenticate, I'm having some issues with networking to authenticate, but looks like it's going through so far. So that's good. I'm there. I should be here. This should be switching, and it is. There we go. This is called this is the Azure portal, the manage.windowsazure.com, the old naming convention. It's going through and populating, being able to view stuff. This was our first attempt at what it is to be able to go off and to manipulate and work with Azure for being able to go off and to do things. This, when you create resources in here from an IT or infrastructure perspective, from an IT pro perspective, you're going to be able to make new virtual machines, have them created, put inside your various different regions you want them to go off to deploy to and work with, and then you interact with them and you work with them. The challenge that you're going to have is, if I take a look at this, I see, in this case, oops, there we go, one VM, AU, C, VM. AU for Australia, C for classic, VM for virtual machine. Thank you very much. Very simple. Virtual machine has compute, it has storage, it going to go off and have durable storage, and then it has networking to be able to go off and function. This is a classic VM. It's different than the other machines that I see and that I work with, which is available inside of this portal. If I go and take a look at virtual machines over here, I can see that I have, in this case, 3 different VMs. I don't see the one that has a C inside of it. I know it's confusing with my accent, S-E-A or S-E-E. I don't see, or the letter C, VM for Classic versus Resource Manager. We're basically, I'm going to be completely up front, we're in a transitionary period where we've gone in last May and we've switched over and are now using a new way of going off to provision machines. They're called Resource Manager, or Azure Resource Manager capabilities. It uses a new API set to be able to configure and to work with them. You have to update your tools and skill set to be able to think of that new way of working inside of an Azure Resource Manager group, and then you provision machines inside of it. It's actually, in my opinion, a bit more intuitive to understand how to configure a machine to work inside of a cloud environment than the old way of doing things. And I'll talk more about architecturally the differences between them in my session tomorrow. But you need to know, if you make machines that are in classic mode, you can't see them and manage them with Resource Manager tools and templates and capabilities in the new way of doing things. And so when I get customers that are saying, well, I want to go off and create some machines and try out Azure and work with it, I'm going to try to pressure you to go to this environment here, manage them and work with them inside of the new portal, or the preview portal still, as it's called, which is designed to work with the new API set, the new way of creating things. So all the demos and all the stuff that I do all uses this new environment for the most part, and then not the old environment. Now, one of the interesting nuances about this is that we have hundreds of different teams that all work on various different components within the Azure environment, even within the same organization of compute, as an example. And so some of the new troubleshooting tools that exist that I showed off in my previous session only work against classic machines. They don't work against the new resource machines, resource manager machines. Some of the stuff that my colleague Pierre demonstrated with Azure Resource Manager as an example to do disaster recovery and business continuity only work against classic machines. They don't work against resource manager machines. So one of the caveats you have to be aware of when you're working with Azure resources is where do those resources exist? Are they in the classic world or are they inside of the resource manager world? Hopefully in the resource manager world is going to be where you're going to be doing your net new development as opposed to your old development. There will be migration tools to move old stuff over to the new world further down the road from our timeline. We got various different teams working on migration skills to move things over. I mention this because I've already had a couple of customers talk to me this week and also in previous weeks where they're like, which side do I work on? Do I work on the old or work on the new? Try the new. If you need to, go back to the old way of doing things with classic virtual machines. And obviously we have the ability to switch between them all, switch to the preview portal on that side, and likewise on here, I can also go in and switch over to my other portal as well, the old Azure portal, as it's known as, inside of the environment. That was my first piece. I want to make sure that we all got clear on stuff for how that works. Switching is different on each one. Now I'm over here to 6, back to this, and we took a look at it. Well, I alluded to this at first, and someone got it correct. Yes, browsers are the main way of doing this. Which browser do you want to use? Thank you for the one at the front there, right at the very beginning. It said Edge, Chrome, Internet Explorer, Safari from a Mac, Firefox if you want to. It doesn't matter. Any modern browser will work with the portal. I personally bounce between Chrome and Edge and Chrome based on how I'm feeling on that day and which link I happen to click on and which machine I'm using. And so the devs within Microsoft work with all those different browsers to test to make sure that they happen to work. And generally, each one is going to have an equal experience as far as being able to go off and to work with different ones. So right now, I'm actually showing you that previous demo. I was doing it all within inside of my Azure environments using the Edge browser. I'm going to attempt I know I haven't switched yet. It's on purpose. I'm going to attempt my demo from the previous session where I'm logging in using a Chrome browser into the system because my IT department at Microsoft has actually enforced that I have to go and do a multi-factor authentication. The tools you use have to be able to support the different layers of security that are in place, and we have the ability to do multi-factor auth, or in this case, sign with a smart card. I'm going to see if I can do this one. What should happen is it should call my phone. I like how I preface all these things. And this time, I think I remember what I did wrong when it comes in. It's always fun to have the data center in West US call me.
Microsoft sign-in verification system. Please enter your PIN followed by the pound key to finish your verification. If you
Cross your fingers.
your sign-in.
Yes, that's how it's supposed to work. So that's one form factor of that's one capability as far as multi-factor authentication is concerned. I bring this up because I have the exact same possibility of taking place when I'm using PowerShell. PowerShell against my subscription, if it's been lit up that says it has to have multi-factor authentication, I might have to authenticate with a smart card on my machine or have to do some kind of a two-form factor authentication with voice prompts, or in this case with a PIN being input inside the system, whatever happens to be. Your tools have to be able to support that as well. So in this case, this is my Chrome browser. It works the exact same way. Here is my quick demo resource group that existed from before. It's got some machines into it. If I'm inside the browser environment, I want to delete this guy to get ready to go for a quick demo I'm going to do in a moment. So let's go ahead and clean this guy up. I always make all of my resources inside the Azure Resource Manager inside of individual resource manager groups, which allows me to very quickly clean up my demos and delete stuff and make it so I can go ahead and work cleanly. Same thing applies to individual projects. You organize them inside of resource manager groups as well. So, i.e. previous versions, Safari, Mac, Firefox, that sort of stuff, they would all work as well. They all could support multi-factor authentication. They could support smart cards. It's all built into whatever browser capabilities it is that you wanted to work with. So Azure Resource Manager, this is something I'm actually going to be talking about with my session tomorrow, once again, when it comes about performance. I'll be talking about it potentially with one of my colleagues who's going to be doing an Azure Stack session tomorrow to talk about Azure Resource Manager templates as well. But essentially, regardless of the tools that you're using to manage this, if it's a direct plugin into Visual Studio because you're a developer, if it is a command line tool like PowerShell or other command line tools, or if it's through the portal itself, you're going to be using Azure Resource Manager templates or ARM templates to deploy your compute infrastructure against the Resource Manager services, which will then go in and provision your resources using the various different providers: VMs, storage, networks, network interfaces, direct connection, gateways, databases, you name it, they basically will go off and do this. So this Resource Manager concept works in the form of templates. I'm telling you about this historical information here because it's part of the infrastructure you have to understand. This is the start of, in case you're not in the DevOps world, if you're an IT professional that just deals with existing infrastructure, you're not that involved inside of developer projects. In the DevOps world, they use the term that comes up a lot, which is infrastructure as code. The ability to basically describe your infrastructure in such a way that it lays out the subnets, lays out the network information, the connectivity, the machines that are in use, describes those machines, how they're configured, who can talk to what, whatever it happens to be, and then is stored inside of a source control. And then when you deploy your application against that, it uses the source control version of that infrastructure, deploys it to whatever mechanism it is you're going towards. Maybe it's Microsoft Azure, maybe it's Google Compute, maybe it's ARM templates, or not ARM templates, maybe it's AWS, whatever, and it'll just go ahead and deploy it. It'll always be done the same way. ARM templates gives you that capability. That now means that you are the holder of that sanctity of that individual declarative file or JSON file of the ARM template. That introduces a new complexity for you. How do you maintain the integrity of that particular template file, which can get quite massive? And how do you go ahead and to make sure that it's checked in, it's not being tampered with, it then is able to go in and be modified as required to be able to go off and deploy it after the fact. So once you've progressed past the concept of I'm using the web browser, I'm going to go off and configure ad hoc different pieces of resources, or I'm going to get a bit more advanced and start using a template to go off and to do my deploys. How do I go ahead and start to deploy these things using command line tools? Let me see this guy right here. When you're deploying infrastructure, again, this is from a Chrome environment. I'm going to go ahead and say new over here. I'm going to choose my very simple compute down and using a data center. Change this over to Resource Manager. This is actually going ahead and going to ask me the basic information of an ARM template of a single VM. ARM templates allow me to define infrastructure with regards to the machine, the storage account, the networks, that sort of stuff. It also allows me to basically have the proper term, what is it? Parameterized? Allows me to fill in parameters. Yes, I speaks very well. Someone was joking that we should do these evening sessions with beer on the table. I think we should put that in the eval forms as suggestions for next year. Make it nice and simple. It's going to ask me for some basic info. I'm going to choose an existing template. Now I'm going to create a new one. West US sounds fine to me. These basic parameters are defined inside of the ARM template that's being used. This is a default ARM template for a single Windows-based machine. I'm just going to go ahead and choose a DV2. Keep the default settings for storage accounts, networks, and everything else. Summary, hit OK. In the background, it's now running that ARM templates, validating it's all correct, submitting that into the Azure Resource Manager engine. It's then interpreting and parsing that file for the information, using the variables from within that file, and then now provisioning me compute resources in a subnet that has a public IP address and has a storage account that's going to be storing that machine, and then blows it into my subscription for me to be able to go off and to use. I can do the exact same concept instead of using the browser interface to be able to do this. Wait for that guy to finish a little bit. Using some command line tools. And this is where, coming, press the button, there we go. We have another command line tool choice. Who here uses Windows-based machines to get their work done every day? That's what they administer with, that's their administrative workstation. The majority of the room. I see at least a couple of fruit devices in the room. There's one. Are you running Windows on that device, sir? Or are you running Mac OS on that device? Mac OS on that device. My condolences. However, because you are so brave, I will give you my very first award of a maple syrup with your name on it. You have to come down afterwards and get it. I have 2 more of those, so pay attention. The reason why I mention that is because most people don't realize that 1 in 5 machines inside of Azure right now are actually Linux-based machines. And administering of those Linux-based machines can be done from a Windows machine. But if you're from an environment that likes using Mac OS, or that you happen to run your own Linux environment, you're running Red Hat Linux or Slack or whatever you want to use, you can do all the same kind of stuff that we're doing without having to use PowerShell with using what's known as the Azure CLI, or Azure Command Line. PowerShell is the most default. That's what I'm going to go to. I'm a Microsoft person. I'm using a Microsoft Workstation. I want to go off and interface and work with Azure. I can do it all through PowerShell. But the team that I work with on the Azure Compute side, they've actually got a whole, they split themselves into 2 different areas of responsibility. One of them is what we call for what I call the Linux side of the house, and one of them is the Windows side of the house. And they're actually asking all those engineers that may have only ever been working on the Windows side of things to start using non-Windows OSs and to start using the command line tools from the other side of the house, which is the Azure command line tools, because you need to understand the pains and the gains and the positives that both of those different sides have to be able to go off and develop them and work with them. And so the Azure CLI is something, if you have not as of yet dove into, give it a try, the Azure CLI. You go off and you install the Azure CLI very simply by going to, in this case, I've got an article right there, PowerShell install configure. That actually is all command line tools, including the Azure CLI. You can even load the Azure CLI in your Windows-based box. So let me make this guy a little bit bigger so you can see it. Right there. So obviously I've got my PowerShell. I can go ahead and work with my PowerShell environment. Not that one. My PowerShell environment. In this case, this is my ISC to go off and do a couple of different things. I can zoom in on that to make it a little bit easier for you guys to see for the stuff I'll be working on in just a bit. And you can see here that I can go in and basically, if I think I'm still authenticated, let's double check. I'm going to log into my PowerShell command line tools. Tells me, oh, that's an organizational ID. Let me switch it to the proper login prompts for you. I'm going to spare myself the danger of not having my phone work. I'm going to sign in with a smart card instead. Plus, I'm showing you as well how to do this with a smart card. I'm going to unlock my smart card. There we go. It was cached, but I'm unlocked. I'm going to be able to go ahead and to get information about my current subscriptions that I have authorization to use with that login ID. You can see I've got a couple of different ones that I've got. I've got one subscription that's called TED ITE. I've got one called Rick Demo and one called Corey's Application. And then I want to go ahead and set my Rick Demo as my default subscription for when I'm going to go ahead and interface and work with this environment going forward. There we go. I'm now using that particular resource. And this is a resource manager group that I'll be creating in just a moment to be able to go ahead and configure it. But remember that simple, let's go ahead and make a Windows VM that I went through the new compute Windows VM, go ahead and to work with it. Provided I have in this case, kind of show you both worlds here. If I go ahead and I have my resource areas, I've got my quick demo is not quite done being deleted yet. No, it is. Rick Quick Demo is done. Let's go ahead and make a new resource group called Rick Quick Demo. Make it out of West US. Hit create. That's basically my container that's going to hold everything inside of that environment, inside my subscription. If I go back to my command line tool, this is going to go ahead and to make a new deployment inside of a resource group called Rick Quick Demo, and it's going to be using an Azure ARM template that is actually stored in a public repository on GitHub, which is called Create a Simple Windows VM. If I go ahead and just do it this time with that deployed, there we go. So with resource templates, remember that nice GUI interface that I had to fill it out on the web? On the command line, it doesn't look as nice. In this case, it's asking me for the storage account name, quick demo, AU. Admin username is going to be Rick. Password, go ahead and create a password account. DNS name, Rick, quick demo. And it goes off and spins and spins and creates and creates and works in the background. One thing I will mention, the PowerShell that I'm using right now, remember how we had that whole transition period between the old portal and the new preview portal that's going on right now? We're having a similar transition growing pains between some commandlets that we made that were designed for service manager commandlets as opposed to resource manager commandlets. And we actually had this big discussion on GitHub and on the community, in the PowerShell community, about which way we should go. Should we stay the route that we went, which is a stateful switch that has to be thrown to go from the old to the new? Or should we go the route of the rest of the world that's using PowerShell and keep it stateless and instead just have new commandlets that are designed for Resource Manager and other commandlets which are designed for Service Manager until Service Manager goes away? We went the route that the community was talking about, that we suggested and worked with, and they suggested that we work with as well, which was go the route of a stateless, go back to the way the PowerShell should be, and not have a switch command. So right now, if you've been working with Azure and you've been making PowerShell scripts to go off and do stuff, you might actually have a switch mode inside of your PowerShell scripts. That's no longer going to be required. I'm mentioning this because right now I'm using a preview version of the PowerShell, version 1.01, which is basically stateless, and you have different commandlets for the old and different commandlets for the new for the ways of working things. This guy keeps on running, keeps on providing and going. This is the same thing as the spinny thing that you get on the portal for stuff that's being developed. So if I actually go back and look at the portal for a moment, this is back inside of my Edge browser. I'm going to lose track of which browser I'm working with, by the way. I believe I called it Rick Quick Demo. And there we go. You can see that my PowerShell command has gone in and started to populate objects in parallel with my resource manager, my Azure resource group, which is, in this case, making a network interface card, a public IP address, and a VNet. It's currently still provisioning the storage and provisioning the VM to sit inside of that storage, which will eventually populate itself and show up here as well. Now, from an Azure commandlet perspective, if you're going to use the Azure CLI, you install that the exact same way and from the same location using our web PI tools, or if you're from a non-Windows device, from a download location, to be able to go off and to use those Azure CLI tools. Once you install them, it literally is type in the word Azure for the start. And this particular version, which is version 0.09.11, is still the old way of doing things, which is using Service Manager. There is a new version of this which allows you to use Resource Manager. Basically, you preface everything by going the command Azure and then what you want to do. In this case, like Azure login, Azure logout, Azure VM create. Here's the command lines and the stuff that you have to go off and do that. I will absolutely tell you right now, in pure honest faith and truth, I'm not an Azure CLI guy. I'm a PowerShell person. But I have yet to take the plunge to use a fruit device and use the Azure CLI to be able to get everything done. However, if anyone would like to donate their fruit device to me for an extended period of time when I return to North America, I would be more than happy to go ahead and to use that if you want to. So command line tools, they come in very handy. I showed you a bit of PowerShell through the PowerShell ISE program to be able to go off and to work with stuff. It's still plugging away, doing stuff for some very, very simple things. Now we have to go with the next level of complexity, which is, how do I keep things straight? Well, let's go off and first of all talk about file editors. The tools of choice for file editors range, again, in popularity based on individual preferences. It's almost like a religious debate between the operating system wars or the mobile device wars, which ones you want to use. I started authoring Azure templates and ARM templates with my personal favorite, which was Notepad. Then I was introduced to a new one from a developer friend of mine, which was Notepad++, because it actually recognizes formatting and stuff. And I thought that was a godsend. Like all of a sudden, all my text files were actually moving and doing the right stuff. I could do compares and searches, and so I recommend that one as an option with Notepad++. But then recently, one of my colleagues on my team, who's more in the DevOps space, was saying, oh man, just go ahead and use Visual Studio. It's a lot easier. Go in, it goes in and is able to create a new cloud project and then go have a nice resource picker to go off and drag different types of options inside of your environment. And I'm like, dude, there's no way in HE double hockey sticks that I could say, I have to say that because they're recording, that I could convince this room that they need to go off and install a full-fledged version of Visual Studio to edit a 1K text file. And by your chuckles, I assume that is correct. Especially if it's going to be like 80 gig install on your laptop to be able to just edit that 1K text file. And he says, okay, well, how about you go and try this one? And so this is called Visual Studio Code. It is available for the Mac, Linux, and Windows. And it is a very cool tool to be able to go in and to manage and modify and work with text files that gives you structured formatting. And it's open to be able to receive, when it comes out of preview, individual plugins, just the same way that Visual Studio accepts plugins as well. So in theory, there may be things coming out for tools like this that would allow you to go off and edit ARM templates in an easier fashion. So I started to use Visual Studio Code to try some things out. And for the most part, it's actually pretty good for what it's trying to do. Let me just go here and bring it up. I'm going to close that guy off. And open this guy up. Let's do it this way. So it's a lightweight install. You can, if you're an old man like me, increase the text size to be able to see a little bit better. This is a JSON file. JSON files are also visible inside of the Azure portal if you wanted to. By when you're going through the deployment process, you can say show the Azure template file. I'll talk about the different layers of what goes on inside of a JSON file in just a moment. But basically, as you can see on the right-hand side, if I go in and say, for instance, admin username and highlight this guy, I can see the other references for where admin username comes into play. You can see over there. You can go in and choose different variables, like where is location being used, and you can see that location is actually used an awful lot within that file. Currently, I'm at the first dot. I can go down to the other dots to find out where they are for an automatic searches on different things. I can see where the VM name is referenced. In this case, the VM name is referenced way down here. I can go down and take a look at that. There's VM name that's highlighted. So this is absolutely boring as crap for every developer that's in the room right now. But for an infrastructure guy or gal, it actually is quite cool because I'm just used to Notepad. And probably if you haven't dove into using an actual IDE, you would not have seen these capabilities that are in there either. So comes into play, very cool. It is a bit of a learning curve. Just use it as a text editor, it's not too bad. But it does recognize JSON formats quite nicely. And the big thing that I like is things like this. When it properly puts in the closed squiggly brackets and the commas and the full stops and the rest of the sort of stuff, it reminds you when you make a mistake and forget to close them off, which could cause your whole thing to blow up and make a big mess all over the place. So Visual Studio Code is definitely one of those things that you could look at. If you follow some of the other people that are here talking on the Azure track, if you will, James Bannon is going to be doing a session on Friday using ARM templates, and he's going to go into such depth that probably my ears are going to bleed with regards to stuff that he's doing. But he actually uses an editor that's quite popular in the open source world. It's called Atom, that allows you to go through and also edit and manipulate JSON files and objects and resources as well with the Atom editor. I have not used that one personally myself. I plan on taking in his session to learn more about it and probably might switch to that one there. Because ultimately, all you're doing is you're editing a freaking text file. And that is your infrastructure for what that happens to be. Now, a little bit more about this text file, where it comes from, this JSON file. Basically, it was a bit scary. That one there is about 145 lines long to define all the different components that are required to deploy an Azure compute resource on top of Azure. This is an example of what that particular template looks like, which is actually known as Template 101, Simple Windows VM. Inside of there, you have a schema that identifies these are all the different options and the definitions inside of what's possible. So I'm using a schema version 1.0. That part there you generally don't touch for the ways that we have them deployed right now. Then you have these things that are parameters that get filled in. This is the pop-ups that happen at the command line, or these are the fields that get filled in on the web interface when you go through and you deploy using the web portal to be able to go off and deploy. In this case, you've got storage account name, you've got a min user name, you've got a min user password that pops up, that sort of stuff. Then you have a whole section that is different on every single template that's out there that is known as variables. Variables are things that are constant but are used throughout the different Azure templates, the ARM template. And that's where you see things like VM name, like I showed you, VM size, IP address that are being requested, the prefix that you want to use, the subnet name, how you want to name it, all that sort of stuff is in there. You can go in and change any of these anytime if you want to, and have the expected results that you should. Then we also have the individual resources being called. This is probably the biggest learning curve that you'll have learning ARM templates and how they work. There are various different Azure documentation resources out there about how to go off and to provision a new gateway, how to go off and provision a new VM, and how to do these different sort of things. But an ARM template is literally a living document that can evolve. You can go in and say, almost like a for next loop, and have it deploy 20 machines in a row. If you put them in the right order and make the proper calls. The only way you're going to learn how to do that is to look at other people's ARM templates and learn for how they worked it as well. It's the same way you probably hack through and learn PowerShell with all the different scripts that people have made too. We do have a community gallery of a bunch of different community-generated templates. We're over 385 templates right now with probably in excess of 100 different contributors that are community-based contributors that make new templates on the fly. Part of my job that I work with on my team is talking with customers and working with them to build Azure templates that represent the infrastructure for the project they're trying to deploy. And so I just recently did one and worked in conjunction with one with a guy on my team that created one for a particular media company that does a content management solution that currently has a offering inside of the Azure Marketplace. But it was an old template concept of Service Manager that was a single VM. We made them a multi-tiered 5 VM infrastructure, front-end, back-end, database, that sort of stuff, that now makes it that it's an Azure ARM template that represents about 85% of their deployments with this one template file. So you could start with that one there if you're looking at how to deploy their particular solution for content management on the Azure platform, all through working with these JSON files and with these different parameters and now resources. Now, the neat thing about these resources is, let me see if I can see this here on the screen because it's so small. This one doesn't have it, but you can see here things like API version. I'll mention that as well. when you make a call with a resource template, you're basically giving instructions to the Azure Resource Manager. Use this particular API and do the following stuff to do something, like make a new network or make a new machine or make a new storage account. As I found out the hard way, and so did a whole bunch of other people, including Pierre a little while ago, the API version changed for how we do DSC extensions. And DSC extensions are used to modify machines. And so our ARM template had the wrong version of a deprecated API that no longer existed anymore. And so it failed and gave you this lovely barf information on the screen. And you had to basically dissect to figure it out, do some research and do some searches and find out, oh, that particular API has been deprecated. Now there's a new one that we should be using. Update the template, check it in source control, boom, deploy, and now it works. People go off into work. Does this have it? No, this one doesn't have it either. This has default values that can come through, and that's it. Okay, so one thing I will mention is, and I talk about this more tomorrow with architecture, is that all these different things also with ARM templates and with Resource Manager can now have dependencies. So if you think about a highly available SharePoint deploy, you need to have Active Directory, you have to have SQL, and then you have to have the SharePoint application and web front ends on top of that. You can't deploy the SQL until after the Active Directory is up and running. You can't deploy the SharePoint until after the SQL has been initialized and databases have been created. And so you have dependencies you can put inside of your ARM templates that will wait until certain things are done before it goes in. You could do the same thing with an 855-line PowerShell script if you wanted to, with various sleep routines and stuff like that. Or using an ARM template, you can just simply carve that up for the bulk of the infrastructure, leave the automation for the domain controller, for the SQL piece, and for the SharePoint piece to be fired off as extensions, but then have the base core infrastructure take place as part of that ARM template to make it more efficient. Now, this is the area here that I literally, and I'm, again, full-out confession here, I'm not a GitHub user. I'm just starting to use GitHub. It is one of the easiest source controls out there to be able to go off and to work with. We use GitHub and Microsoft's perspective to store all of our quick start templates. And so when you're on the Azure portal and you're looking for things to learn about how these resource templates work, you'll actually be referred to our own search engine, which then points back to our own our own public GitHub repository. Inside the GitHub repository, we have all those source control versions of those different templates. As we determine that there's a template that's now out of date, as an example, anyone that uses that now deprecated PowerShell extension, we can actually take a request from the community to update that, push it back inside of our environment, it gets accepted, and now everyone is going to be using the proper versions. So this is how we do scale. This is nothing new. This is something that the open source community has been using for a long time for a variety of things. I mean, Git was created to be able to do source control with Linux kernel, that sort of stuff. So we are using GitHub to be able to do both documentation and also able to go in and to host our Azure Quick Start templates environments that are up there. Now, the neat thing about GitHub is the fact that it has tools that are both desktop and command line based. If you are a person that works in the open source world and is comfortable with command line and Linux and also with Mac as well, as more on the developer side, you probably are thinking this guy with the hat is just talking incessantly about this thing that's been just the normal way of doing source control now for years. It's brand new for the infrastructure folks to use these different Git commands. I'm hoping some of my infrastructure friends are agreeing with me here, because Git, honestly, is a little bit complicated. Some of the terms just don't make sense for what you're trying to do between a push and a pull and a check and a commit and that sort of stuff. But essentially, what you're going to be able to do is integrate this into those different tools. So you have training wheels, per se. You can basically abstract what's going on behind the scenes, or in front of the scenes, with the Git commands in the back end to be able to do some of your source control. So you can go ahead and, with Visual Studio Code, as an example, go ahead and clone a repo up on Azure, or up on GitHub, and then be able to pull down your copy of the templates, or maybe you have your own private one that you're using as part of your enterprise environment. And that's where you're going to be storing your own secure copies of those templates. And then you're able to go in and to make changes, make those commits, put in documentation about what those commits were, what those changes were, push them back up into the environment, and now everyone has access to them once they've been accepted. So think of this as like individual little snapshots and version controls of stuff. And let me see here. Where is this? I've got, if I can see it here before I switch. So I've got an environment right now where if I try to go in and use this little GitHub or Git integration icon, with this particular file, I'm inside of a directory structure on my local machine that's not currently under Git control with the client that I've installed. On this box, I showed you this ugly screen very quickly. This particular screen basically goes through and lists off the current configuration of my local Git client that's currently configured and installed. The main thing I wanted to show you down here was at the very bottom of this, which is this is actually my username on GitHub for this demo account. And this is the email address associated with it. And then here would normally be my password. But I have a tool, an open source tool that I've installed that allows me to use my credential store on my local workstation as my secure location to store my password. So instead of having to store it inside of plain text inside this environment, I now can just use my local credential store to log in. That translates over to being able to use, if I can find the right tab, this guy, there we go. So this is my Rixter CDN demo. I've got one repo that currently exists. It's called demo templates. Inside my demo templates, it literally is a blank repo. There's nothing inside of it right now. That particular utility is simply showing you that it's a demo template. I've got a README file, which is extremely descriptive, which is simply the name, and just a bunch of old demo templates. I'm able to go in on my local machine. This is the desktop client for GitHub. Choose my demo templates environment. And this is the client. You can see I did my initial commit, which is simply my blank, just a bunch of demo templates that I pulled down. And then I went ahead and did a very test commit where I added in a whole file. So basically, it monitors a local directory structure on my box that has a track changes capability to look for individual changes of files and also contents of files that are text files. And I literally just went down here and copied in, under demo templates, a new file called Azure Deploy. When I open up that tool and I want to modify this guy, I can use my good old-fashioned more apps, use Notepad. Ugh, no I won't. Looks like a dog's breakfast. Open with, well, let's use Visual Studio Code. Now when I pull it up this time, and I make it larger so you can see, you can simply see that it's now inside of a new area that's called GitHub, and it's a repo called demo templates. And it knows that it's now integrated into my source control. So if I wanted to, here's my variables. Here's like West US, here's standard A2. Let's go in and change this guy from a standard A2 to a standard D2. I have a change in one of my files for a particular file. I've got one unsaved change. Go ahead and make that save. It's now changed. Looking inside of Git, I've got to open my folder here. One sec. Open folder, GitHub demo templates, select it. There it is. Now it becomes Git aware. It sees that there is one outstanding change that have happened on this guy that is different than my local database entry of what was previously there inside that one file. And I'm able to go ahead and make my commitments to this environment. Where is it? There we go. Because the change, let me make this a bit larger. Updated machine size. Commit those changes. It's now saved locally. It's now recognized, and I can go ahead. And this is where I get messed up, if it's a pull or if it's a push. I'm going to push it up. You can see it's working in the background. This guy's authenticating across, and this is where my demo potentially is going to hang for a bit until it's able to go and update that. When I go back to my website of Git, you'll now see there's now a new file that's been added, but I get all that lovely little information about what was the change that occurred, who logged it in, what time it occurred, works in a collaborative state. Again, this isn't earth-shattering if you're someone that's been working in development for quite some time, but it is for people that have been working just in pure infrastructure, definitely a bit different for where you can go off and work with things. Working with ARM templates, very basically like I just did right there, is the way that you start. And there's no way other than simply diving in and trying out some situations that you need to go off and work with. With the Azure templates, basically, you're going to be working with the quick start templates as your mechanism to start. Inside those quick start templates, we have our search interface that works on azure.com. And what I suggest is you find stuff that is of interest to you for working with your trial. If you just go to azure.com and sign up for a trial, that will work for at least 30 days, $200 before one or the other expires. And you can work with these quick start templates to go off and deploy a basic VM, how that works, maybe a multiple VM, maybe a subnet, maybe a subnet gateway, whatever happens to be. You can try off a bunch of different options for those quick start templates. These all point back down to the GitHub repo, and new ones are being added all the time. And there is a larger community besides just the Microsoft individuals that are going ahead and integrating with this. Now, one thing that happened in the past is this started back in May, where ARM templates now work with Azure IaaS. But remember that whole concept of a whole whack of different teams working together to make Azure work? They all choose to implement different functionality inside of the Azure Resource Manager at different times. It's now to the point where essentially all the stuff that you want to do from the old portal or from PowerShell can now be done inside of an ARM template. It used to be that if you had the need to go in and to create an express route, or if you wanted to do any kind of network configuration, if you were working in the old world, it was this awful XML file that you would have to go through and modify, and basically extract after you've made it and modify stuff and then bring it back in again. It was quite honestly very cumbersome. Now that's able to be done just through an ARM template instead, with much more capabilities than what you had before. What do I got left for this guy here to show? Let me just quickly show you that, where is it? Go over here to azure.com. You find all this different information under resources, under templates. My personal opinion is this is a great way to be able to find those templates as they come out and as different ones are available. You can see here it's sorted by date by default. As you can see, there's a wide range of them. In this case, here is a relatively new one, which is create a new encrypted Windows virtual machine from a gallery image by one particular MVP. You also have a bunch of different open source ones as well for people to go off and work with open source capabilities. Some popular ones that are on there are things like Docker and Docker containers, able to go off and to make a highly available cluster with a variety of different tools. You can even go off and work with some DSC pull servers as an example. Now, one thing you can notice here is, if I can capture this one here, a simple DSC pull server. You can see when it was created, who it was that made it. We have the nomenclature of having square brackets MSFT if it's a Microsoft resource, but take a look at the bottom right here. This individual that did this is no longer using the 101, 201, 301 level of complexity indicator. This is now simply community-generated ones where this particular consultant or this particular PFE had a project. They needed to go off and make something. In this case, it was a DSC pull server, and they wanted to share that back with the community. They checked that into the community repo, and now it's available for anyone to take a look at. And they are the owner of that particular one. People go off and update them. Search capability is actually quite good to be able to go off and do searches. In my earlier demo, the traditional, very quick and simple Minecraft is one example. This is a hilarious example of, here is a non-Microsoft operating system, Linux, running an application that runs on top of Java that is not included in the base Linux distribution. And so this gentleman here, Guy Bowerman, is actually on the Azure Compute team, is a big Minecraft fanatic. And so he actually made an Azure template specifically to deploy an Ubuntu server inside of a single VM environment, inside of a single VNet inside of Azure using Resource Manager. And it goes in and will download the latest version of Minecraft, download and configure the required version of Java to be able to have it run on that Linux box, and then go ahead and configure that entire install so it's hands-free with some parameters that he pulls from that particular template. And will build you a Minecraft server of whatever size you want, configured with names and sort of stuff, whitelisted and that sort of thing. And that's all done through a bash script after the application has been installed. So translate that into something more work-related. He's just installed a Linux VM, configured it with a network and storage, and then downloaded an application which can be scripted to be able to take additional inputs and then configured firewall rules on that one box. But he's doing it as an example using a Minecraft VM. Same thing can be applied to a Windows box or to other more complex situations. Or if you need to have one fired up real quick, just use this template and it basically will build you a Minecraft server in about 3 minutes. Completely automated if you want. These guys as well, if you choose them, will go through and give you all the parameters that exist that you want to go off and to use. The neat thing I like about it as well is if you want to get your feet wet with how you can go off and deploy, besides using the web interface, it also tells you how you're able to do that with both the Azure CLI. There's the command prompts you have to run, Azure space config space mode space arm, and then Azure group deployment create blah, 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 blah. You guys can read it. That's the command line you would use to be able to deploy this without having to use the web portal versus the PowerShell way of doing it as well. And you can also go through and view this information directly on the GitHub site directly if you wanted to, which links you back to all the different files and resources that you can go ahead and learn with. The Azure deploy.json file is the main file that does the work. The parameters are different parameters that are possible, and then this is his auto-configuration bash shell script that is used once that Linux box is deployed to be able to get everything all done. Good example, good learning tools if you can step back and think about how things can be deployed inside of that environment. So from a how do I get started perspective, I've given you just the opening volley of information with regards to how you can configure your workstation. That was a blank workstation this morning that I had to go off and finish configuring. It was a matter of, well, I'll say minutes because of the conference Wi-Fi for where I was at the time. I was rather busy and congested at lunchtime. I went ahead and downloaded Visual Studio Code. I downloaded my 80 megs of my Git solution, my Git desktop as well for Windows. The PowerShell SDK, sorry, the Azure SDK, which includes the PowerShell preview as well as the Azure CLI, and had that guy all up and running probably within a matter of half an hour or so for all the different pieces. Then it's a matter of configuring those pieces to be able to work with my account, which isn't that hard to be able to configure. But that builds one workstation to be able to go off and to work with. If you're more comfortable just getting started to using the portal, there's nothing wrong. You can do everything I showed you today exclusively inside that portal, including editing those JSON files if you want to. We have a web editor built into the JSON file template deploy that'll go off and allow you to deploy that fashion in that way and edit those individual files. If you want to get more advanced, you can start to go and bring those guys down to your local box, be it a Mac, be it a Windows device, to be able to go off and to edit and to work with. The different scenarios you can use to start to look at using Azure in this kind of environment with a new modern workstation. As I mentioned, my buddy Pierre Roman has gone ahead and done a session on Azure Site Recovery, and doing disaster recovery is one of the ways that people start to use the Azure environment. If you're more into supporting your developers and doing more of a dev test environment and getting more involved in a more modern infrastructure type of a role, obviously dev test is a great tool to be able to go off and to work with on the Azure space. Lift and shift of packaged applications gets a bit more complex, but you can obviously go and deploy individual apps that are inside your environment right now that are currently running inside of different virtualization technologies, as in Hyper-V or as in VMware, and move them up in Azure if you wanted to. And then if you are a dual-hatted individual that does dev as well as doing infrastructure, you obviously can go ahead and start developing stuff and just working directly using those Azure templates. Those four scenarios take up about 50% of what currently is inside of most public clouds today inside of our different workloads that happen to be there. That guy's done, that's there, that's good. Look at that, I'm on time. I have about 10 minutes left and a couple of items up here as giveaways for possible questions that people might happen to have. You know what one of them is, obviously. What do you think? It's an introductory session talking about how to get used to upgrading your tools and your tool sets. Nothing is earth-shattering here. It's literally just simply baby steps of looking at how to evolve into working in this fashion. It does take time. I'm still learning how to use Git effectively and how to even get it to authenticate correctly, as you can see from it not authenticate on that box over there. I have one question over there in the corner. Yes? Can you actually come up to the microphone right next to you so I can hear it? I'm sorry. I will repeat the question, but I'm having trouble hearing too.
That's okay. So in the classic portal, if you have your own OS image which has been uploaded, so to use that to create a VM out of it, you need to have that particular OS disk, VHD, as well as the image in every storage account, as well as the cloud service.
Yep.
So is that the same case in ARM as well, or?
Okay. The question was basically around OS management images. You basically can go in and make your own custom image, have it loaded and used off a VHD file inside of the old portal, the classic portal. Is that still possible in a new portal? Absolutely. You would have to go in and either upload it into that new environment to be able to have access to it. It's a different type of storage account in different area. You then would be able to go off and deploy referencing that one individual VHD file if you wanted to. If you have existing solutions on the classic side, there will be migration tools to move your existing projects from the old over to the new, all done inside the Azure environment. We're working on those to make it as painless as possible. But we're going to be maintaining and working with the service manager for quite some time still until everybody's ready to move their workloads over.
So now my question was basically, if you have uploaded VHD into one storage account, right, and to create the VMs in another storage account in the same old portal, classic portal, through the PowerShell, you need to copy that particular VHD across the other storage account as well. So do we have to still do the similar thing with the ARM?
That's a very specific question that I have not tried as of yet. So thank you very much for asking that one there. Basically, she's asking, hey, in the old way of doing things, you would have to go in, if you're going to use that same VHD in a different storage account, do I have to copy it from the old storage account to the other additional storage account to be able to use it? In the old way of doing things, you definitely had to. I have not tried it in the new way. I'm pretty sure you have to as well, but I want to verify that before I say absolutely that's the way it works. Basically, storage accounts can live anywhere. So if you're going to access a resource that's outside of that particular storage account, it needs to have access to that particular storage account because it could be in a different data center in a different region. So it needs to be in the same one to be able to do it, to make those resources. With resource groups, basically, the resources inside of those resource groups are inside that same region are obviously going to be available to other resource groups inside of that region as well. But it's all basically on the region-by-region basis for where those resources are. That definitely is worth maple syrup if you're interested in one for that one there. Right there for you. Right down here in front, yes, sir? So the question is basically, can you use the template in the same kind of fashion as being able to have multiple different types of inputs for multiple VM names to have them inside of that one individual logic of that template? It's going to depend on how you design to architect it. I personally would go with the approach of having everything declared correctly inside of that one ARM template as opposed to having to go off and call off to other resources. But you can take inputs from other files if you want to. Doing multi-machine templates is definitely a very advanced functionality of which you have to go off and learn how to go off and work with. And you're going to want to walk before you crawl, crawl before you walk and walk before you run to be able to go off and to understand how to provision one machine, all the different resources, and then opening up to multiple machines, and then calling off to different resources to make new resource names for how to be able to go off and to work. So it's possible, but it becomes more complex. Start off small, work your way up from there to be able to get more complex where it is. I see people sneaking out. Hopefully they remembered about the evals. I'm just going to put up the slides. Don't forget about your evals, please, for this one session. It's very important for us to know how the session was, if it was what you're looking for. This was a gamble for me. This was my wild card. I'm supposed to submit multiple sessions. They actually accepted this one. And I was only gaming on having my introductory one and also my more advanced design, because this one's kind of personal. I kind of change this one each time for the different tools that I've been working with to be able to see it. If you saw stuff in here that was interesting, please let me know in the comments inside those evals. If I missed something completely that wasn't there, oh man, you should have talked about the Atom editor. You should have talked about these different resource browsers that are available. Let me know as well so I can modify this one the next time to also share those inputs as well for different things. I've actually got a blog entry that's in my draft modes folder right now, walking through this particular session, the different resources that I found that I'm now trying to update with more resources. So I'll be happily stealing a bunch of stuff from James's session on Friday to include it into this one to be able to make this one even better. But with that, I do want to be sensitive of your time. Again, if you want to get a hold of me, this is the easy way to do it, is through the Twitters at @RichterCDN, or send me an email at rclaus@microsoft.com. I'm going to give you 3 minutes back in your time because I started a little bit late, so I think I'm about balanced out for where I should be. And say thank you very much for sticking around this long. I believe there is still one more after dark type session happening, and I believe they might even have food as well. I'm personally hoping that we have some pies and those fancy ketchup squirty device thingies that I've never seen before except here. You laugh, but I did a blog post about them. They're so impressive. I wonder if anyone actually has the copyright or the IP inside of North America to be able to market those ones, because they're absolutely brilliant. So I hope to be able to find some outside as well. But thank you for joining me, and thank you for coming out once again. And continue your learning path, see what's going on, and I enjoy to talk to you again tomorrow, hopefully. I'm all out of stickers if you're looking for some. I will have a new stack of stickers that says my other computer is an Azure data center at my session tomorrow. Coming up, I believe, in the early afternoon about Azure performance and availability. Thanks for joining me. See you around.